My name's Dulta Doherty, and this is the Recruiter Startup School. In this podcast series, we will be interviewing industry experts, founders, and investors from the agency recruitment world. We will be bringing you the inside track into how to set up, operate, scale, and sell your recruitment business. This week's guest on the Recruiter Startup School is Barry Cullen. He's been in our industry for over 20 years. We discuss his journey from recruiter in the 90s to running his own law firm, which specialises in all things legally related to agency recruitment. Barry, or Backdoor Barry, as he's known in our industry, primarily focuses on fee disputes. However, he let me pick his brain on a wide range of topics. We covered restrictive covenants and post-employment restraints, legal disputes and the tactics behind it, the pitfalls of shareholder agreements, employment contracts, LinkedIn ownership, terms of business that suit your funding, GDPR, liabilities for on-site contractors, scaling your business with your terms, what's involved for launching a UK entity in an overseas market such as America. There's so much to take in this interview. If you need any further information, Barry's details will be in the show notes. I hope you enjoy, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Barry Cullen, welcome to the Recruiter Startup School.
Walter, good morning. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to get into the detail today, and I know we can all learn a lot from you. I've given everybody a bit of a brief rundown into your background, but could you elaborate a little bit more and tell us, go back to the early stages, and how did you get into recruitment, and how ultimately did that lead you to launching your own law practice?
Sure. Well, like most people, I fell into recruitment. It was the mid-late 90s. I had just dropped out of university, believe it or not, doing an engineering degree. It turned out I wasn't as good at maths as my teachers thought I was, and I needed a job. A friend of mine worked in an office, getting paid fairly well, to do some photocopying and envelope stuffing, and he said he could get me a job. So I tootled along, not even knowing what they did, and then found out I was working for Huxley Associates in America Square back in the day.
Oh, wow.
Now, a lot of people listening to this won't have 20 years in recruitment like me, so they won't necessarily realise that mail shots didn't used to happen with a click of a button. 20,000 people get the CV. If you wanted to send out a CV by mail shot, you literally had to photocopy it, and you had to post it out to hiring managers. Simpler days, but very different days to today. And that was my job. But about a week in, I gave someone a bit of lip in the office, and he didn't like what I said, but he liked the way I said it. And I was the next day working as a resourcer. And so I did that for about a year with Huxley's before a couple of my managers left to run computer personnel. And they gave me the call a couple of weeks later to say, if you come over, we'll make you a 360 recruiter.
Wow. And here, back then, I've only been in recruitment for about 8 years. Was recruitment easier then than it is now because the black book was there and not everybody had their details out on the internet? Or has technology made it easier? What do you think?
Well, remember this, and the most important thing, I'm a failed recruiter. I didn't make my millions doing recruitment. I didn't retire well doing recruitment. I rode the mid-late 90s.com and then year 2K recruitment bubbles, where you had a fax machine in one corner and a money printing machine in the other corner, and recruitment was that easy. So different people may have had a different experience to me, but at the time it was pretty easy because you were able to start accessing candidates more readily. This is when JobServe and Computer Weekly were just starting up job boards, and you were able to get an advert out pretty quickly and get people in. I mean, in these days, you could sell advertising space. Your client wanted to do an ad campaign, and you would be able to sell it and put a margin on top of it.
Wow.
There were different. It was a different industry then.
Yeah.
While it may have been more difficult to get hold of candidates in particular markets, unlike today where, typically it's easier to access candidates, there were different challenges that came with it compared to now.
So you're doing well in recruitment through the booms and ultimately that little bust in the .com. When did you start thinking about becoming a lawyer, and how did that process come about? What was that experience like?
Like most of my good ideas, they came up with them in the pub. We were on Kingsway, so sort of in the Holborn area with computer personnel, which anyone that knows the law will know. It's where all the Inns of Court are. It's where a lot of the bigger law firms are in that sort of area. Just getting chatting to people in the pub who happen to be lawyers, it came pretty clear to me that the law and recruitment, weirdly enough, are very similar jobs. In the law, you might be trying to convince a judge that your case is better than the other side's, whereas in recruitment, you might be trying to convince a client that your candidate is better than somebody else's. And likewise, in recruitment, you might be trying to convince your client that the deal on offer is the best deal they're going to get. And in recruitment, you might be trying to persuade your candidate that long term, the role that you have on offer for them is better than anything else they've got on the table.
I think the key difference, though, is that attention to detail and to be able to look at documents and really hone in on it. I think lots of recruiters, they might be a bit more verbal instead of like looking in detail at a document. Was that something that you figured out pretty early, that you were quite analytical?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, the failed engineering background. And then recruitment processes, making sure you were as precise on those as you could be, and then moving over into the law, you realise that being analytical is very important. It's the ability to see where the deal is, so not where you are today, but where is the deal, and then moving things in the right direction to make sure you end up there and end up there well, and making sure you get all the details right on the way.
So were you a mature student at this stage, or
I wouldn't go so far as mature. I was older than most of the other students. I wouldn't really call myself mature even at that point.
All right. So you're in law school. You've done this for X amount of years, and then you think, okay, I'm going to get into law, but focus on recruitment. Or did somebody approach you about that?
Well, effectively, I kept working in recruitment even while I was studying. So I left tech recruitment, set up my own business as a legal. It was a sort of, the plan was get myself as much work experience as possible, because with my background in recruitment, I realised that being a grad was no use. Being a grad with experience was valuable. So I needed to get as much legal experience as possible. But I also realised there'd be a lot of work that I didn't want to do or I didn't have capacity to do. So if I could make a margin off other people at the same time, then that may pay some of my debts and bar bills and what have you while I was at university. So I ran my own agency, and then when I eventually finished law school, I exited out of that. Not millions, but cleared off some student loans by getting rid of that agency. Before I then went into becoming a trainee solicitor.
You ran your own recruitment agency. Did you have people working for you, or was it an independent?
It was an independent. I had a temp book running, so it was just me running an ad hoc temp book of people going off doing projects, doing jobs that I put them out into.
All right, great. So look, the purpose of this podcast is for us and experts like you to impart a bit of knowledge to help people who are considering setting up a recruitment firm. You must sit in front of so many different types of recruiters who are thinking of setting up their own companies. At what point should we start thinking about the legalities, and how does that process look?
Well, funny enough, I've got clients in every market space you can imagine. From tech, life sciences, oil and gas, care, nursing. I represent agencies across the board. But funnily enough, they almost all follow the same life cycle. So when they first come to me, they're typically experienced consultants. They're looking at setting up on their own, and they're asking some fairly pointed questions around their restrictive covenants, because they want to understand, for the most part, what their obligations are, because they don't want to do anything underhand. But also, what the limits of those are and what the enforceability of those are.
Can we jump into that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I mean, very, very broadly, restrictive covenants, post-employment restraints, as most people will know them. They're a restraint of trade. So they're designed to prevent people from carrying out their chosen trade or profession. And as a matter of public policy, that's unlawful. So the starting point is you're not allowed to restrain somebody. But then, of course, over the generations, bloody lawyers have got involved, and we chip away at that very simple rule and introduce a hell of a lot of exceptions.
Because I've had friends
which
that
are pretty...
have had major corporations come after them, and it's more just the cost of the fight rather than who wins the fight is the thing that really gets them.
Oh, for sure. And, I'm pretty shameless. I act on both sides of that. So I act for employers who are pursuing outgoing employees, and I act for employees who are defending themselves from their previous employer. And generally speaking, there's a few strategies in play. One of which is, if you're the employer and someone's starting up on their own, what better way to protect your business than to keep their eye off the ball by making them so worried about these restraint disputes and so worried about the legal cost that they don't have enough time to do any recruitment, and therefore they don't actually take any business away from.
And what about the other side of the coin?
The other side of the coin: delay. If they don't issue a claim, then every day your restraint period is dwindling. So if you can delay the process, within reasonableness, within the rules in relation to the CPR, then it's to your advantage. But what's most important is getting some early advice. And I typically do this in exchange for the price of 1 pint of fine ale. Get some early advice on what these restraints mean to you. Are they enforceable? Or are they completely ridiculous and unreasonable? And therefore, what you can do.
And I've heard a common practice to kind of get around it is to maybe get somebody else to make the phone call or send the email. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, you see it. I enjoy it when I see it because I can tell you from experience. You get yourself down to room 37, which is the court in the Royal Courts of Justice, where interim injunctions, emergency injunctions are granted. It doesn't take long to convince a master or a judge that that's a game that's being played. There's no way this person woke up on Monday morning and thought, "Here's a list of people I'm going to phone." When they had no previous dealings with them, and it coincidentally is the same day that our ex-employee started at the new agency. So it's a game people play, but it's a pretty see-through one.
I'm going to continue on in the life cycle of it, but just the questions come into mind with LinkedIn. Can a company make you shut down your LinkedIn, or do they own the property of that, or do you know any?
Yeah, there's a joke about a fellow that goes and gets his blood test results from the doctor, and the doctor tells him, "Look, I've got some good news for you, and I've got some bad news for you." And ever the optimist, he says, "Well, give me the good news." And the doctor says, "Well, we're gonna name a new disease after you." So much like that in the law, the current position is everybody thinks they know the answer, but nobody's gone as far as actually getting to the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court to actually get some precedent set around this issue. But if you look at it broadly speaking, LinkedIn's terms of use are pretty clear in respect of individual user licenses that, that information is personal to the user. That can change where you've got recruiter licenses, paid for licenses, where the agency's paying, then a lot of that information is the property of the agencies.
I think that's interesting because the recruiter license doesn't really let you connect with people. And if you were to connect with somebody, it would be on the other side. But the recruiter license does let you analyze who would be the right person to connect with. But then if you download that information, like you could, I don't know if you still can, then is that information owned by LinkedIn? Is it owned by you? Is it owned by the company? It's a bit of a minefield, isn't it?
Oh yeah, 100%. And there will be many different scenarios where these things play out. There was a case a good few years ago now, but there was a case where the courts were pretty happy to hammer down on an outgoing employee because that outgoing employee had downloaded intentionally in the few days before he left his job. He downloaded vast swathes of his LinkedIn connections and vast swathes of the agency's actual database. and then uploaded it into his brand new shiny empty CRM a couple of days after he started his new position. You can imagine at that end of the extreme, the courts are much more likely to find against the employee. But if it's a circumstance where somebody's had their own LinkedIn account for many years and they've known a lot of people and been connected with a lot of people before they joined a particular agency, then you can see why the courts might be less inclined to say there's confidentiality issues if they then move into their new business or move into a new agency and rely on that data.
Let's move on before everybody's heads explode with the permutations on this. So back to the life cycle. The first thing is restrictive covenants. What's next? What type of things should we be considering before we launch?
So the next thing to consider really is, how are you doing it? Are you going to grow on a self-funded, do some deals, fund your business basis, or are you going to get some finance, whether from an investor or externally? And that will then flavor the approach that you might take to your business. Typically, the speed with which you can do things. If you're self-funding and you're doing it on the basis of deals and money made, then of course you need to bootstrap. You need to make sure people like me don't come along and go, here, spend this many thousands of pounds on new contracts, spend this many thousands of pounds on this, that, and the other, and you haven't actually even made any money yet. You need to remember the real core value that a recruiter brings is doing deals. So as a bootstrap startup, you need to be focusing on that. Mobile phone, laptop, LinkedIn, access to a few job boards, get on with doing business.
And kind of hope for the best and make sure you get paid within 6 months before things get serious.
Yeah, before your money runs out. And that's what it comes down to. Yeah. that sounds like a voice of experience there.
It's not about me. Let's crack on here.
But then the other approach is, if you're financed, you can accelerate things. You might want to get some terms that are more bespoke to you, more polished to what your offering is. You might be hiring people straight away, and therefore getting employment contracts, and doing the flip side of those restraints, where you're making sure that you're putting reasonable restraints in place to protect your business, from those first employees.
Yeah.
And then, really importantly, and this is where me and the guys at Intro Protect are most interested, making sure that you do get paid. Of course. Making sure clients aren't taking candidates through the back door, and making sure if there are any disputes around rebates.
And I'm gonna go into that with you in a minute. Can I bring you back to, if you're funded? Do you ever deal in those type of disputes with whenever somebody's invested in a recruitment business, and how did those contracts work?
So it's funny. It works one of two ways. Either somebody puts some money in, and they decide, look, let's just put some money in, see if this works, and if we're making some money further down the line, then we'll put a shareholders agreement in place, or we'll get our articles of association dealt with, or we'll put some loan agreements in place, or debentures in place, or what have you. But let's wait and see if we make any money first. And then you roll forward 6, 9, 12, 18 months. All of a sudden, there's a load of money in the pot, and you don't have any paperwork to back it up. So then the interests of the individuals then can be very different. And what might have been a very friendly opportunity to do the paperwork right at the start might become slightly more difficult further down the line when there's actually money on the table. So if you're funded, my view is spend some of that money on actually making sure that your relationship with the funder is nailed down. So you've got a shareholders agreement, or you've got a loan agreement, or you've got a debenture back in the loan agreement, and making sure your articles work. It's worth spending a bit of that money to get that right. But if you're not, and you're bootstrapping it, then try not to spend money on these things straight away. But then make a real point of diarising a point in your business plan where you're saying, right, by this moment in time, whether it's the amount of money or whether it's the amount of time passed, that's when we want to revisit our structure and our arrangements to make sure we put something in place. Okay,
wow. Let me ask you, where did you get the name Backdoor Barry from?
Well, this is all about backdoor recruitment.
Okay, that's good. Okay, let's go.
To the uninitiated, There are circumstances where clients may, often accidentally, but sometimes nefariously, they'll meet a candidate through a recruiter. They won't be interested in hiring them for that job for whatever reason, but then roll forward 2 or 3 months, and the recruiter finds out that the candidate is now working for their client, and of course wants to get paid. And that's the main thing that we do, and getting people paid in that situation. So that the name came about from that. It seems to have stuck for good or for ill.
Very good. And what's next on the life cycle of a client in terms of if they're growing? I'm sure there's different legalities that they have to worry about if they're a 50-person office, or if maybe they're moving internationally, or what does a founder have to consider, and what does that involve?
But that's a pretty broad question. So I might split it in two, if that's all right with you. I might talk about what that looks like in the UK, and then what that might look like if you're looking at expanding internationally, because I think there are sort of different considerations there. So in the UK, it's making sure your terms are in place, whether you've begged or borrowed those from your previous employer or elsewhere. If you're bootstrapping, or if you're funded and you've put them all in place yourself, through hiring your first employees, hopefully keeping hold of them for long enough till they're profitable, and dealing with any HR fallout that might come about during that process. Then eventually, when you start to get a decent amount of pillars in, particularly if you're running a tech book, getting a compliance or an operations function set up, to make sure that you, the director or directors, are not having to spend all your time reading contracts, and negotiating contracts, worrying about whether your contractor's compliance work has been done. So whether you hire in for that, or whether you use one of the external back office solutions that exist out there, you just need to make sure you've got that nailed down. We are working in an industry, or in fact in a world, where everything is becoming more regulated. We used to only have to worry about the conduct regs. Then we had to worry about the conduct regs and IR35. Then we had to worry about conduct regs, IR35 and AWR. Then conduct regs, IR35, AWR, and new IR35 rules. And now GDPR. That is the only time I will say that acronym in this phone.
GDPR. Okay, can I jump in on that? I was in Canada when they introduced their own GDPR, and it was just ignored. I get a feeling that now, with all the privacy stuff that's happening and all the rest, it's going to be a bit more serious for us. When do you think the first court cases are going to come against recruiters for sending unsolicited mails?
So I think, as with a lot of these types of things, the most worrying element of this for recruiters is not the Information Commissioner's Office, or their equivalent in any other European state. It's not about the big regulator knocking on your door if you're running your own relatively small or mid-sized agency. It is those court claims, and those court claims typically are going to arise from a disgruntled ex-employee who's going to dob you into somebody, or who's going to cause an issue of their own, or typically a disgruntled contractor. I've seen in the years of doing this work, people will often use Data and Privacy and Data Protection Act as sort of bats to hammer on somebody about something completely different. And I suspect that's where the issue is going to arise, because of course people can bring claims under the GDPR within their local courts, and I think that's going to be the issue. You're going to just the mere dealing with those issues, and I suspect they'll be some pretty quickly. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some savvy individuals who already have an issue that they're annoyed about, and they're waiting until Monday. Come Monday, they'll start jumping up and down.
Oh, here we go. Okay, I jumped in there. You were about to explain when a company is scaling, and if they want to go, say for America, for example, everybody's setting up in New York right now with the aim of going to other places in the US. Well, what does that process look like from a legal standpoint? Walk me through that.
It's important just to say first that I am not a US attorney, so I can't give advice on the law in the US. But I have been involved in running projects and setting up US operations for UK recruiters. So I have found the most important things initially are to really get your partnerships in place. So whoever that is that's giving you advice, whether it's consulting project management advice on how to do it operationally, or whether it's getting good tax advice in relation to how to ultimately get the money you're making in the US. And I must say, there's a bucket load of it being made over there. But get that money back into the UK and back into your pocket without paying, everybody all of the money in tax on the way, and then getting decent legal partners in place. I cannot recommend highly enough, and it's unusual for me to recommend other people who do law, but I cannot recommend enough membership of the American Staffing Association. Particularly for a smaller agency, it is as cheap as chips. A year's subscription will cost you a decent lunch. Those rates go up as you get bigger, but they have a really good legal support function where they will provide you documents, they will provide you ongoing legal support and referrals to other lawyers that work in the recruitment and staffing space. And remember, in the US, that's what they call it. It's not all recruitment.
They call it recruiting as well.
In order to recruiting and staffing, where recruiting is perm and staffing is contract predominantly. So making sure you get that right. And also remembering the US is effectively many, 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 many countries added up to make one country. The federal system, state to state, you will have different laws and different approaches to things. Just a couple of examples. Good luck enforcing restrictive covenants in California. It's harder to enforce them there than it is in France, and I can tell you in France it's pretty bloody difficult already. So that's one thing to look out for. And then in New York, they have some very specific rules around when commission must be paid, in particular to leavers. Of course, everyone will appreciate in the UK discretionary commission schemes. If you quit your job, you ain't getting any more commission. That's why everybody quits on payday. But in the US, it's very different. In New York, it's very different. You need to make sure your commission scheme is set up to ensure that you don't end up having to pay lots of commission to somebody that left you months before. So be wary of that side of things in the US as well. I think that covers your question.
Yeah, it more than does. So just back to one of my last topics is liability. How do we make sure that we're not liable for contractors on site? And is that process like more complicated for somebody who's maybe in oil and gas recruitment or than say an office worker in IT? And are you involved in that as well?
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely involved in it. So getting involved in those sorts of things is something I do. What you need to do first is identify what your appetites for risk are. If you've just started up an agency and there's no money in the pot and there are no assets owned, then theoretically your liability is limited to the value of the company and the amount of money you put into the company. So at that phase, you may decide that you want to take a much higher risk approach to your business, where you may take lower levels of insurance, subject to clients being okay with that, and you may do deals in countries or in environments like people get helicopters to work for the oil and gas world, which other agencies may not be willing to take risks on because there's not a lot to lose. So it's worth it for the money. But as that agency gets bigger and it starts having actual value and worth, maybe assets and money in the bank, people may want to take a slightly different approach to their sort of appetite for risk. I'm not saying their appetite will reduce, but they may become slightly cuter about how they approach it. And the ways that I see that dealt with are from the simpler contractual position of negotiating better with clients to push back on liabilities or to remove indemnities in contracts or introduce indemnity caps so that there's a clear cap to what your cost would be if something went wrong is the first. The second, making sure you've got decent insurance in place to protect you, making sure you're dealing with one of the brokers that really knows the industry. so you can make sure you've got the right cover in place. And then also pushing as much responsibility down onto the next person in the supply chain. So the contractor's PSC or the contractor's umbrella company, make sure they actually do take on that responsibility, mirror it, push it down to them. And if they're taking responsibility, remember most PSCs, most personal service companies, which is what most individuals will operate through if they're not earning a low amount, they have very little money typically in the bank. It's money in, money out. Because effectively it's a person, it's almost effectively their salary coming in and out. So they're not going to typically have a lot of assets or a lot of cash in the bank. So it's really important that if you give the contractor an obligation to have insurance in place, that you make sure they have it in place. Get copies of insurance certificates so you can satisfy yourself that if everything does go wrong and you do get a big claim against you, that you're able to rely on somebody else's insurance. That's the ideal scenario.
All right. So Barry, one last thing is just what's going on with your business right now? Where can people find you? How can they get in touch with you? What type of things can you offer recruitment firms? I know that I need to come down and get you to have a look at my terms because I've been caught out a few times recently. And walk us through that.
Sure. Well, we're a full legal service offering. So theoretically, we can get our teams to work on anything and everything that might affect a recruitment business. So from terms, employment contracts, HR and disciplinary issues, disputes, debts, the whole enchilada. But in reality, our real core focus and where we bring the greatest value is in fee disputes. So whether that's a backdoor hire, whether that's a rebate dispute, a multi-agency introduction dispute, or simply a client that just won't pay their bill, that's where we really come to the fore. And we're Intro Protect. So here's the plug, www.introprotect.com. And within that business, we have 3 core offerings, which are called Recover, Detect, and Prevent. Where Recover does exactly what it says on the tin. We make sure the recruiter gets paid for their work, but we're really key to protect that end client relationship. So we do as much of that as possible by whispering in the ear of the recruiter to say in your next call with the client, say this or that, to drafting emails for the recruiter to send to the client so they don't even know there's a lawyer involved. And then if that doesn't work, we can come out to the open in quite a sort of conciliatory mediation approach. And likewise, if that doesn't work and the client and the recruiter decides they still want their money, then we can ramp up the pressure on the usual formal correspondence and court proceedings all the way through to enforcement if necessary. In fact, we just had sheriffs, which is the old name for high court enforcement officers, in the Shard. Was it a week or 2 ago? With police in tow, getting an end client to be paying up their bill of, I think it was about £28,000. So making sure that gets paid. And because we are so good at it, it's all contingent. Our clients typically work contingent, so do we. If we get you paid, we take a percentage. If we don't get you paid, then we don't get paid. It's as simple as that. So that's Recover. Detect, without boring people too much, we have designed our own algorithms and we have our own human search teams who will go and find these backdoors for you. So our clients will upload their introduction data to our secure site. We then run a bunch of algorithms to identify those candidates and try to identify instances where they are either working with or connected to the end client, or if they're contractors where they may have overstayed their contract. And then our humans will then quality assure that, go through, make sure they're solid leads before taking them back to the recruiter. And again, no charge for that up front. It's all contingent. So if we find them and we get paid, then the recruiter gets paid and we get a percentage off that again. And then finally, without going on too long, Prevent. This is a monthly subscription service where we will go into an agency. We will sit down with their salespeople, sit down with their compliance people, review their terms of business, identify areas where they may be weak or where they could be improved. We'll then go away, reel off a report to say these are the improvements you should be making, and then we go back into the business. We implement the changes, we train the staff, we make sure they know what they're doing. And the reason we do this service is because it makes it easier for us to do detect and recover. So if and when we then recover fees for people in the future, the subscription they paid us gets knocked off the contingent fee. So effectively it makes that cost neutral ultimately. That's us in a nutshell.
Excellent. Barry Cullen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ralph. Speak to you soon.
What an amazing guest Barry was. I can't thank him enough for coming on and sharing 20 years worth of information in half an hour. I feel like my head is about to explode with all the information that he gave me, and I'm going to have to listen to this 2 or 3 times to really take it all in. I got a lot of value from it, and I hope you did too. Our other podcast, the Recruiter Abroad Show, tells the story of expat recruiters around the world, and it's been getting great reviews. And so check that out if you want to find out what's happening in agency recruitment in Australia, America, the Middle East, and Asia. Until next week, podcast listeners, I hope you're enjoying the show. If you are, give it a little like and share on LinkedIn, make a comment. Every little bit of praise makes all the difference. Give us a star rating if you can on iTunes. And next week we'll have an amazing guest, which I'll be speaking about very soon. We've got some amazing people lined up to come on the show. If I am not covering any topics that you think are valuable, please just reach out, let me know, and we'll do our best to find the best person in the world to speak to about, and help you on your journey to launching, scaling, and eventually selling your own recruitment business. Have a great week.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.